The apple tree bloomed alone in the empty courtyard, its white petals drifting across stones no one had swept since autumn. Eleanor stood at the gate with her hand on the weathered wood, watching those petals fall, and understood for the first time that she might be the only person left to see them. The village beyond the manor walls had gone silent 3 weeks ago. No bells, no voices, no dogs barking at dawn. Just wind moving through abandoned doorways, and the crows that had grown fat, or what the crows had always grown fat on, when no one remained to bury the dead. She had stopped counting days when the count became meaningless. Her hands were calloused now from work they'd never done before. Her hair, once pinned and proper, hung in a loose braid down her back, and the manor house behind her, which had sheltered 40 souls through the winter, now sheltered only her and the vast, pressing silence of rooms where people used to laugh and argue and complain about the cold. Asterisk, asterisk, before we continue. If you'd like to join me for more stories like this, feel free to subscribe. I share a new one every day. And if you don't mind, leave a comment and tell me where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. I love seeing how far these stories travel. Asterisk, asterisk. The morning Eleanor realized she was alone began, like all the others that spring, with the rooster crowing in the yard, though there was no one left to tend him. She had risen in the dark, lit the fire in the kitchen with hands that had learned to coax, flame from reluctant kindling, and gone about the tasks that kept a body moving forward when moving forward was all that remained. The water barrel needed filling. The chickens needed feeding. The goats in the barn made sounds that suggested distress or hunger, or simply the bleating confusion of animals whose world had been turned silent and strange. She had found the last one the evening before old Thomas, who had tended the manor's horses since before Eleanor was born. He'd been in the stable, slumped against the wall near the empty stalls, and she had known before touching his shoulder that he was gone. His skin was already cool. The swelling beneath his jaw and in his neck told her all she needed to know about how it had happened, though by then such confirmation was hardly necessary. She'd seen it so many times, the signs had become routine. The fever, the swelling, the dark marks that bloomed beneath the skin, like flowers made of bruise and rot. She had wrapped him as best she could in canvas from the tack room, dragged him across the yard with strength born from months of necessity, rather than nature, and laid him beside the others in what had once been the kitchen garden. The ground was too hard for her to dig anymore. She had buried the first ones, when her father and then her mother fell, when she still believed in proper graves and proper prayers and the proper ordering of things. But as the winter deepened and the dying continued, the ground froze and her strength failed, and she had simply run out of earth soft enough to break. So now they lay in rows under canvas and old blankets, and she said the prayers she remembered, and she left them to God and the cold earth and moved on with the tasks that still demanded doing. It was wheat to thresh if she could manage it, preserves in the cellar that needed checking for spoilage, accounts her father had kept that she should probably attend to, though she couldn't say why. Who would come to collect debts from a manor where everyone had died? Who would arrive with coin or complaint when the roads themselves seemed to have emptied of travelers? The isolation had crept in slowly at first. The village had closed its gates in late autumn when news came of sickness moving through the country. Her father, the manor's lord, had agreed with their caution. Better to wait it out, he'd said. Better to keep distance between the healthy and whatever dark contagion rode on the wind or in the blood or however God saw fit to deliver his judgment. So the manor had pulled inward. The servants who lived in the village stayed in the village. The manor household family and the staff who lived within the walls carried on with reduced numbers and increased caution. For a while, it had felt like any other winter. Quieter perhaps, more careful, but still marked by the rhythms of daily work and evening fires, and the small conversations that filled the hours. Her father reviewed accounts. Her mother supervised the kitchen. The servants went about their work with perhaps more nervousness than usual, but still with the routines that made a household function. Eleanor herself had spent those early winter days much as she always had, reading by the fire doing needlework. She only moderately enjoyed taking walks around the courtyard when the weather allowed wondering vaguely about the spring and whether her parents would arrange a marriage now that she reached 17 years and was, by all accounts, of proper age for such arrangements. Then the sickness had come inside the walls. It started with one of the kitchen girls, Margaret, who was young and cheerful and had a laugh that carried through the halls. She'd complained of feeling poorly one morning, feverish and weak, and by evening the swellings had appeared. She was dead before dawn. Her mother, who cooked for the household, fell ill the next day. Then one of the grooms. Then Eleanor's own father, who had seemed so steady and certain when he told them all not to worry, that they were safe here, that the manor walls would keep them from harm. The dying had taken a month. Some went quickly, burning with fever and covered in the dark marks that gave the sickness its terrible name. Others lingered, weak and delirious, calling out for water or mercy or people already gone. Eleanor and her mother had tended them as best they could, though they both knew there was no tending that would help. You could ease comfort, perhaps. Bring water. Hold a hand. But the sickness did what it would do, and all your care and prayer seemed to matter not at all when the fever took hold. Her mother had lasted until the end of winter. She'd been strong. Eleanor's mother, practical and firm in the way of women who managed estates and raised children and kept households running through lean years and uncertain times. She had organized the sick rooms with efficiency. She had directed Eleanor in the tasks of nursing with calm instruction. She had seemed, if not invincible, at least unlikely to fall, as if her sheer competence might serve as armor against the thing that crept through their halls. But of course she had fallen anyway, and she had died hard, fighting the fever and the swellings with the same determination she'd brought to everything else in her life, as if dying were simply another task to be managed with proper attention. Eleanor had held her hand through the last night, listening to her mother's labored breathing, gradually slow, and then, finally, stop. And in the silence that followed, sitting in the dark room with her mother's body cooling beside her, Eleanor had understood with perfect clarity that she was now alone in a house full of ghosts. The days after had passed in a kind of numbness. She moved through the rooms, doing what needed doing, because not doing it seemed worse than doing it. She ate because hunger insisted. She slept because exhaustion demanded it. She kept the fires burning because the cold was still real, even if everything else felt distant and strange. And slowly, very slowly, something that might have been acceptance, or might have just been exhaustion, settled over her like dust. Now, standing in the courtyard watching apple blossoms fall, she felt the weight of that solitude in ways she hadn't quite faced before. Winter had been about survival, staying warm, staying fed, keeping the most basic necessities of life maintained. But spring brought different demands. The land itself seemed to wake around her with expectations she had no idea how to meet. Fields needed plowing. Seeds needed planting. Animals needed more than just daily feeding. They needed care and attention of a kind that suggested future plans, future seasons, future time stretching beyond the immediate next meal or the immediate next day. And she found herself standing still, unable to move forward or back, suspended in a moment where the weight of all that future pressed against the impossibility of imagining it. The apple tree bloomed regardless. The crows called from the walls. The sun moved across the sky with the same indifference it had always shown to human concerns. And Eleanor stood at the gate, her hand on the weathered wood, and tried to decide what came next. The decision, when it came, was less a decision than a simple acknowledgement of necessity. She couldn't stay in the manor forever. The stores in the cellar would last through summer, perhaps, if she was careful. But then what? She didn't know how to plant a field on her own, didn't know how to thresh wheat or mill grain or do any of the 100 tasks that turned earth and seed into bread. She could keep chickens alive and milk the goats and maintain the small kitchen garden her mother had taught her to tend, but that wouldn't be enough. Not for a whole year. Not for a life. Which meant she needed to go to the village. The thought sat in her chest like a stone. She had avoided the village since the gates closed, first because her father had forbidden it, and then because there had been no reason to go. What lay beyond the manor walls was unknown now, and the unknown had taken on a weight of dread that made even thinking about it difficult. But standing in the courtyard, watching spring arrive with its impossible demands, she understood that avoiding the unknown was no longer an option. She would go to the village. She would see what remained. And she would decide, based on what she found there, what came next. She waited until afternoon to leave, moving through the morning tasks with mechanical precision. The animals were fed. The fires were banked. The doors were checked and secured. Not that security mattered much now, but old habits died hard, and her mother's voice in her head still insisted on proper procedure. She filled a sack with bread and cheese and a flask of ale, more out of habit than any real expectation that she'd need them. The walk to the village was short, barely an hour down the road that wound through the fields and over the stream that marked the boundary between manor lands and village common. The road itself showed signs of long disuse. Weeds grew thick between the wagon ruts. A fallen tree from some winter storm lay across the path, and she had to scramble over it, her skirts catching on broken branches. No one had been this way in months. The realization made her steps slow, made her heart beat harder in her chest. She had known the village was silent, had known for weeks that no smoke rose from the chimneys, that no sounds of daily life drifted across the fields. But knowing it from a distance was different from walking toward it, from seeing the evidence of that silence grow more concrete with every step. The village came into view as she crested the rise before the stream, a collection of houses clustered around a small green, with the church at one end and the mill at the other. It looked, from a distance, almost normal. The buildings stood intact. The church spire rose against the sky. The mill wheel hung motionless over the stream. But as she drew closer, the wrongness became apparent. Doors hung open. Windows gaped dark and empty. The spring growth had already begun reclaiming the edges of the green, grass, and weeds, pushing up through the packed earth where people had walked and children had played, and merchants had set up their stalls on market days. She stopped at the edge of the green, her hand pressed to her chest where her heart hammered against her ribs. The silence was absolute. No voices, no movement. Just wind moving through empty buildings and the distant call of birds that might have been crows or might have been something else. She made herself walk forward, made herself move across the green toward the nearest house, the baker's shop, where she and her mother had come every week to buy bread and sweet rolls and to exchange news and gossip with the baker's wife, who had known everyone's business and shared it with generous enthusiasm. The shop door stood open. She pushed it wider, the hinges creaking in the silence, and stepped inside. The interior was dark after the bright afternoon, and she had to wait for her eyes to adjust before she could see clearly. When they did, she wished they hadn't. The shop had been ransacked, or perhaps just abandoned in chaos. Sacks of flour lay spilled across the floor, their contents gone moldy and dark. The counter was covered in dust, and in the corner, barely visible in the shadows, lay a shape she recognized with horrible certainty as human. She backed out quickly, her breath coming fast and shallow, and stood in the street with her hands pressed to her mouth. The smell from inside the shop followed her decay and rot and something else she couldn't name and didn't want to. She turned away, turned toward the church, thinking perhaps that there she might find something different. Perhaps the priest had survived. Perhaps someone had gathered there, seeking sanctuary or simply the comfort of familiar walls. But the church was as empty as the shop. The door hung broken on its hinges. Inside, the pews stood in disarray, some overturned, some pushed against the walls as if to make room for something. The floor was stained dark in patches she didn't want to examine too closely. And on the altar, someone had placed a row of candles that had long since burned down to puddles of wax. She stood in the doorway, unable to make herself step fully inside, and felt the weight of all that emptiness press against her like a physical thing. They were gone, all of them, the whole village. Hundreds of people who had lived and worked and argued and loved and complained about the weather and the taxes, and each other as chickens wandering into each other as gardens. All gone, dead or fled or simply vanished into whatever terrible tide had swept through these streets and left only silence behind. She walked through the village in a kind of daze, looking into houses and shops, finding signs of death and abandonment at every turn. Some houses showed evidence of hasty flight belongings scattered, doors left open, food still on tables gone to rot and ruin. Others looked almost peaceful, as if their inhabitants had simply lain down to sleep and never risen. She found bodies in several of the houses, though she didn't look closely and didn't count. The dead were beyond her help, beyond anyone's help, and dwelling on them served no purpose except to feed the horror that threatened to overwhelm her completely. By the time she reached the far end of the village, the sun was dropping toward the horizon and the shadows were growing long. She stood in the road, looking back the way she'd come, and felt a strange disconnection from everything around her. This place had been alive when last she'd seen it, full of noise and movement and the messy, complicated business of human life. Now it was a tomb, and she was walking through it like a ghost herself, neither fully alive nor fully dead, just existing in the terrible space between. She should go back to the manor. It would be dark soon, and walking the road in darkness seemed foolish even if there was nothing left to fear. But she found herself reluctant to move, reluctant to turn her back on this place and retreat to the lonely safety of the manor walls. Because going back meant accepting what she'd found here, meant accepting that she was truly alone in a way she hadn't quite believed until now. The manor had felt isolated, yes, but it had still been connected in her mind to the village, to the wider world beyond. As long as she hadn't looked, she could imagine that life continued somewhere, that people remained, that the world hadn't simply stopped. But now she had looked, and she knew, and there was no unknowing what she had seen. She walked back slowly, her feet finding the road more by habit than conscious thought. The sky turned orange and then pink, and then the deep blue of early evening. Stars began to appear overhead, faint at first, and then growing brighter as the last light faded. She crossed the stream, climbed the rise, saw the manor appear against the darkening sky with one window lit, the kitchen window, where she'd left a candle burning before she left. The sight of that single point of light in all the surrounding darkness should have been comforting, should have felt like home. But instead, it just looked lonely, a tiny spark of warmth in an ocean of emptiness. She let herself in through the kitchen door, set down her sack, and stood for a long moment in the familiar space. The fire had burned down to coals. The candle was guttering in its holder. Outside, full dark had fallen, and with it came the night sound she'd grown used to wind in the eaves, an owl calling from the barn, the restless stirring of animals in their pens. She should eat something, should bank the fire properly and go to bed and try to sleep, should do all the normal things that marked the end of a day. But normal had become a word without meaning, and standing in the kitchen of a house where everyone she'd known had died, looking at the simple domestic tools that had served her family for generations, she felt the enormity of her situation settle over her with crushing weight. She was 17 years old. She was alone. The world she'd known had ended while she wasn't looking. and she had absolutely no idea what to do about it. She sank onto the bench by the table and put her head in her hands. For a long time she simply sat there, breathing, existing, trying to remember how to think past the paralysis that threatened to lock her in place forever. Eventually, because she was young and strong, and the body demanded things even when the mind wanted nothing more than to shut down completely, she forced herself to stand. She stirred up the fire. She ate some bread and cheese without tasting it. She drank ale that might as well have been water. And then she climbed the stairs to her room, blew out her candle, and lay down in the darkness to wait for sleep. It came eventually, though not kindly, and brought with it dreams of empty streets and open doors and apple blossoms falling on graves no one would ever visit. The days that followed acquired a kind of routine born from necessity, and the simple fact that time continued whether you wanted it to or not. Eleanor woke with the dawn, tended the animals, ate meals she barely tasted, and worked her way through the tasks that kept immediate disaster at bay. She avoided the village, avoided thinking too much about what she'd seen there, avoided planning beyond the next day or the next meal or the next small chore that needed doing. But the land around her refused to cooperate with her desire for stasis. Spring deepened into early summer. The grass in the fields grew tall and wild, untouched by scythe or grazing cattle. The kitchen garden began producing in earnest, more than she could possibly use or preserve on her own. The goat's milk came faster than she could drink or make into cheese, and she found herself pouring the excess on the ground because wasting it seemed less troubling than watching it sour in the dairy. The chickens laid eggs she couldn't eat quickly enough. Everything around her was growing, thriving, pushing forward with the mindless optimism of nature that knew nothing of plague or death or solitary girls in empty houses. The abundance was almost worse than scarcity would have been. At least with scarcity, she would have had something clear to struggle against, some obvious problem to solve. But this excess just reminded her how poorly matched she was to the world she found herself in. A proper household would have used all this bounty, would have preserved and stored and prepared for the next winter, would have had the hands and the knowledge and the coordination to take what the land offered and transform it into security. She had none of that. What she had was increasingly desperate improvisation and a growing collection of failed experiments. She tried to make cheese and produced something that smelled terrible and had to be thrown out. She tried to preserve vegetables in brine, the way she watched the kitchen staff do, and ended up with jars of questionable mush. She tried to gather and dry herbs for winter use, but couldn't remember which ones were which or how they were supposed to be prepared. Every task revealed another gap in her knowledge, another skill she'd never bothered to learn because there had always been someone else to do it. It would have been easy to despair. Should have been easy, perhaps. But something stubborn in her refused to give in to the voice that whispered she might as well stop trying. Maybe it was youth. Maybe it was simple bloody-mindedness. Maybe it was just that the alternative giving up completely, lying down and waiting for whatever came next felt like a betrayal of everyone who had died. Her mother had fought the fever to the very end. Her father had kept working on the estate accounts, even when he could barely hold a pen. The servants had tended each other and tried to keep the household running, even as they fell one by one. They had all kept going because going was what you did. And if she stopped now, what had their struggle been for? So she kept going. She made mistakes and learned from them, or didn't, but tried again anyway. She taught herself to milk the goats properly after weeks of frustrated fumbling. She figured out how to make serviceable, if not delicious, bread. She learned which chickens were broody and likely to hatch eggs, which might provide a next generation if she could keep them alive. She started a list in her father's account book of things she needed to remember, skills she needed to learn, tasks that required attention before they became crises. The list grew long quickly. She needed to figure out what to do about the fields before they became completely overgrown. Needed to check the mill? Did it still work? Could she work it herself if it did? Needed to think about next winter, about fuel and food, and how to keep warm when the cold returned. Needed to decide whether to try to manage all this herself or, what? Leave? Go where? To what? That question haunted her more than she wanted to admit. The roads were empty. Yes, but they led somewhere. Other manors. Other villages. Towns. Cities. Surely somewhere there were people who had survived. Communities that had weathered the plague and come out the other side. But how far would she have to walk to find them? And what would she do when she got there? She was a lord's daughter with no lord to legitimize her claim. No family to speak for her. No dowry beyond what she could carry. No skills beyond the minimal domestic arts appropriate to a girl of her class, which was to say, almost none at all. And beneath all these practical concerns ran a current of fear she didn't want to name. The fear that there was nowhere to go. That the whole world had become like the village, empty and silent and full of ghosts. That she could walk for days or weeks or months and find only more of the same. More empty houses. More unburied dead. More evidence that whatever had swept through this corner of the world had swept through all the rest of it too. So she stayed, made her plans for the day and the week ahead. Tried not to think too hard about months or seasons or years. Tried not to count the nights she lay awake listening to the silence and feeling the weight of all that emptiness pressing down until she could barely breathe. And gradually, almost without noticing, she began to change. Her hands, which had been soft and clean before, became calloused and scarred from work. Her skin darkened from days spent outside in the sun. The elaborate dresses in her wardrobe, which required help to put on properly, and were meant for drawing rooms rather than farmyards, stayed untouched while she wore the same simple work dresses over and over, mended when they tore, washed when they became too filthy to bear. She stopped pinning up her hair with the careful attention her mother had always insisted on, and just braided it simply, practically, in a way that kept it out of her face while she worked. The face that looked back at her from the polished metal mirror in her room became harder to recognize. Thinner, yes, she'd lost weight over the winter and hadn't quite regained it, but it was more than that. Something in her eyes had changed. They looked older, more serious, less like the eyes of a girl waiting for her life to begin, and more like the eyes of someone who had seen the world end and was still here anyway, for better or worse. The change frightened her sometimes, made her feel like she was losing herself, along with everything else. But other times it felt almost like relief. That old self, the one who worried about what dress to wear, and whether her needlework was fine enough, and what sort of marriage her parents might arrange, that self had been dependent in ways she hadn't recognized, had existed in a web of expectations and supports and social structures that defined everything, from how she dressed to how she spoke to what she was allowed to think about. That web was gone now, and while its loss was terrifying, there was also a strange freedom in it. No one was watching her anymore. No one was judging whether she acted appropriately for a girl of her class. No one cared if she wore the same dress 3 days running, or if she cursed when the goats escaped their pen, or if she spent an entire afternoon sitting in the courtyard doing absolutely nothing at all. She could do whatever she wanted, be whoever she wanted. The only judge was herself, and she was too busy surviving to be particularly harsh. Summer arrived properly in June, or what she thought was June. She lost track of precise dates, but the days were long and warm, and the solstice couldn't be far off. The courtyard garden exploded into bloom. Roses climbed the walls in profusion. Honeysuckle scented the evening air. The apple tree that had bloomed in solitude back in spring now bore small green fruits that would mature in autumn if she could protect them from the birds and the deer that had started venturing closer to the manor, emboldened by the absence of human activity. She was in the garden one afternoon, trying to tie up the bean plants that had grown enthusiastically, but inefficiently in all directions, when she heard the sound. At first she thought she de-imagined it, a trick of wind or a bird, or her own desperate hope, making sound where there was none. But then it came again, clearer this time. The sound of a wagon on the road. The creak of wheels and the slow clop of hooves. The sound of something moving toward the manor from the direction of the village. She dropped the beans and ran for the gate, her heart hammering so hard she could feel it in her throat. Someone was coming. Someone was alive. She wasn't alone after all. She reached the gate and fumbled with the latch, her hands shaking so badly she could barely work it. Finally, it came free, and she threw the gate open, running out into the road, looking for the source of the sound. The wagon appeared around the bend, a simple farm cart pulled by a single ox, moving at the pace of continental drift. And on the seat, holding the reins with casual expertise, sat a man. Not just any man. A young man, perhaps a few years older than herself, dressed in the rough clothes of a farmer or laborer. He had dark hair and a sun-weathered face and the kind of solid, practical build that suggested a life of physical work. He was looking ahead as he drove, hadn't seen her yet, and she had a moment to just stare in shock that another human being existed, that she could see, another person moving and breathing and real. Then he looked up and saw her standing in the road. And in the split second before either of them spoke, she saw her own shock reflected in his eyes. Whatever he'd expected to find here, it clearly wasn't a wild-haired girl in a dirty work dress running out of the manor gates like something escaping. He pulled the ox to a stop. For a long moment, they just stared at each other across the road, neither quite believing what they were seeing. Then he cleared his throat. "Didn't expect to find anyone here," he said. His voice was rough, uncertain, like someone who hadn't spoken aloud in a long time. "I didn't expect to find anyone anywhere," Eleanor said, and heard her own voice crack on the words. They regarded each other warily. She saw him taking in her appearance, the disheveled hair, the worn dress, the hands she now noticed were covered in garden dirt. She saw him making assessments, trying to fit what he saw into some framework that made sense. She was doing the same to him, trying to understand what his presence meant, where he'd come from, why he was here. "I'm Thomas," he said finally. "Thomas Webb, I was. I lived in the next village over. Before, I've been traveling since spring." Looking for ... double quotes, he trailed off, gestured vaguely at the landscape around him. "Looking for anything, I suppose. Anyone." "Eleanor," she said. "Eleanor Ashford. This is my family's manor. Was my family's manor." They single quotes double quotes. She couldn't finish the sentence. Didn't need to. He nodded understanding. "Mine too," he said quietly. "Everyone. The whole village." They fell silent again. The ox stood patiently in its traces, unconcerned with human drama. Birds sang in the hedgerows. The sun continued its arc across the afternoon sky. The normal world persisted in being normal, while two people stood in a road and tried to process the impossible fact of each other as existence. "Are you ... double quotes," Eleanor started, then stopped, unsure what she was even asking. "Are you real? Are you staying? Are you going to leave me alone again?" "I was going to pass through," Thomas said. "Check the manor, see if there were supplies worth salvaging. Then move on." He paused, looked at her more directly. "But if there's someone here, if you're here and you're alive, ... double quotes, I could use help," Eleanor said, the words tumbling out before she could consider them. "I don't know what I'm doing. I don't know how to do any of this. The fields need plowing, and I don't even know where to start. And winter is coming eventually. And I don't have nearly enough stored, and the animals ... She heard herself babbling and forced herself to stop, took a breath. "I could use help," she said again, more calmly. if you were willing to stay. For a while. I could pay you. Eventually. Once I figure out how any of that works. Thomas studied her for a long moment. She saw something shift in his expression calculation, giving way to something that might have been relief, or might have been its own kind of desperation. He was alone too, she realized. Had been alone as long as she had. And the weight of that solitude was written in the lines around his eyes, in the careful way he held himself, as if he'd grown used to having no one to rely on but himself. I can stay, he said finally, for a while anyway. See what needs doing. Help where I can. He climbed down from the wagon, moved with the stiff care of someone who'd been traveling too long. Fair warning, though, I'm a farmer, not a manor servant. I don't know anything about how estates are run, or any of that proper business. Good, Eleanor said with feeling. Because I don't either. Maybe between us we can figure it out. He smiled at that, a small, cautious expression that suggested he'd forgotten how. Maybe we can at that. She led him through the gates into the courtyard, and for the first time in months, the manor didn't feel quite so much like a tomb. There was another person here, another living soul who might understand what it was like to survive when everyone else had died. They might not have answers, might not know how to build a life from the ruins of the one that had collapsed, but they could try together, and that was more than she'd had yesterday. The ox, unconcerned with such philosophical matters, lowered its head and began to eat the grass growing between the courtyard stones. Thomas watched it for a moment, then looked at Eleanor. Where should I start? He asked, and she found herself laughing not from humor, but from the sheer overwhelming relief of having someone to ask that question of not being the only one who had to have all the answers. I have absolutely no idea, she said, but we'll figure it out. And somehow, standing there in the afternoon sun with a stranger who understood what surviving meant, she almost believed it. Thomas settled into the manor with the ease of someone who had learned not to expect permanence. He made a rough camp in one of the outbuildings, the old groom's quarters, which were separate from the main house and still reasonably sound. He refused her offer of a proper room inside, said he was used to simple quarters and didn't want to presume. She didn't push. The manor felt less empty with him nearby, but perhaps it was too soon for either of them to be comfortable sharing space in the way that living under the same roof would require. The first few days were awkward. They were strangers trying to establish rhythms of work and conversation in a situation neither had any template for. He was clearly uncomfortable with the class difference between them. She was still a Lord S daughter in his mind, even if that title meant nothing now, and she was equally uncomfortable with the sudden shift from complete solitude to having to account for another person as presence. They circled each other carefully, polite and uncertain, each trying not to impose on the other while also trying to figure out how to work together. But work was the thing that broke the ice, as work so often does. The fields couldn't wait for them to become comfortable with each other. The animals needed tending regardless of awkwardness. The manor required maintenance, whether they felt like talking or not. And in the shared labor of those tasks, they gradually found an easier footing. Thomas knew farming in a way Eleanor never had and never could. He looked at the overgrown fields with a farmer's eye, assessed what needed doing with calm practicality, and set about doing it. He couldn't plow the large fields alone. That would require more oxen and more hands than they had. But he could clear the kitchen garden properly, could expand it to produce more of what they'd need. He could tend the goats with skill, coax better milk from them, teach Eleanor the tricks of cheese-making her previous attempts had missed. He could hunt and trap with casual competence, bringing back rabbits and pigeons and once, improbably, a deer that provided meat for weeks. For her part, Eleanor knew the manor's resources in ways Thomas didn't. She knew where her father had stored seed grain, knew which buildings held tools and supplies, knew the layout of the cellars and the contents of the storerooms. She could read the accounts her father had kept, could puzzle out what debts were owed, and what rents should have been collected, even if collecting them from dead tenants was an absurdity they both acknowledged and moved past. Together, they began to create something that resembled a working household. Not the grand estate the manor had once been, with its dozens of servants and complex hierarchy, but something smaller and more practical, a partnership of survival that gradually became something that felt almost normal. They ate meals together in the kitchen, neither comfortable with the formality of the dining hall. They shared the day's work over bread and cheese and whatever vegetables the garden provided. They talked about practical things, what needed fixing, what supplies were running low, whether the roof would hold another winter. And slowly, carefully, they began to talk about other things too. Thomas told her about his family, his father who had been a tenant farmer, his mother who had managed somehow to keep 5 children fed through lean years, his siblings who had all died in the space of 2 terrible weeks. He spoke of it without much emotion, as if the grief were still too large to access directly. Eleanor understood. She did the same when she talked about her parents, about the household that had been. The loss was too raw still, too vast to examine closely. They could acknowledge it had happened, could state the facts of it, but dwelling on it, letting themselves feel the full weight of it, that was still too much. What they could do, instead, was focus on the present, on the work that needed doing and the small satisfactions of doing it well, on the animals that depended on them and the garden that responded to their care with increasing abundance, on the gradual reclamation of order from chaos, routine from randomness. By midsummer, they had established patterns that felt sustainable. Thomas worked the garden and the animals, hunted and trapped, repaired fences and buildings with patient competence. Eleanor managed the household supplies, preserved what the garden produced, tried to keep accounts, even though there was no economy to account for anymore. They shared the cooking. Though Thomas was frankly better at it, he'd cooked for himself and his family, while Eleanor had only recently learned which end of a knife to hold. The manor began to look less abandoned. The courtyard was swept regularly. The animals were sleek and healthy. The garden grew in ordered rows instead of wild tangles. It wasn't the estate it had been, would never be that again, but it was no longer a tomb. It was a place where people lived and worked, and occasionally even laughed. The laughter surprised Eleanor the first time it happened. They'd been trying to repair a fence the goats had destroyed again, and Thomas had made some dry comment about the goats being agents of chaos sent to test their patience. She'd laughed before she could stop herself, and then felt guilty for it, as if laughter were a betrayal of the dead. But Thomas had smiled, pleased to have amused her, and something in that exchange had given her permission to feel things beyond grief and exhaustion. They could laugh, could find moments of lightness even in the midst of all this darkness. It didn't dishonor the dead to keep living, didn't diminish the tragedy to find small joys in survival. The dead were gone, but she and Thomas were here, and they had to figure out how to be here in a way that wasn't just grim endurance. So they did. They worked hard during the days, slept heavily at night, and in the spaces between found moments of something that approached contentment. Not happiness, not yet that seemed too far beyond reach, but contentment. The satisfaction of work well done, the pleasure of a good meal after a hard day, the simple comfort of not being alone. As summer deepened toward autumn, they began to make plans for winter. This year would be different from the last. They would be prepared. They had food stored, fuel laid by, animals in good condition to weather the cold. They had 2 sets of hands instead of one desperate girl trying to do everything alone. They had each other's company, each other's skills, each other's stubborn refusal to give up. It should have felt like enough. Most days it did. But there were nights when Eleanor lay awake in her room and wondered what they were doing. Were they building something real, or just clinging to the ruins of something dead? Could 2 people sustain an estate that had once required dozens? And perhaps more troublingly, What were they to each other? They weren't master and servant. Couldn't be when they worked side by side and shared everything. But they weren't equals either. Not really, not with the weight of class and history, and her family's ownership of this land still hanging between them. They were ... something. Partners in survival. Companions in solitude. Something that didn't have a name, because the old names didn't fit, and they hadn't figured out new ones yet. She didn't ask Thomas what he thought about it. Didn't want to disturb the fragile equilibrium they'd achieved. But sometimes she caught him looking at the horizon with an expression she couldn't quite read, and she wondered if he was thinking the same things. Wondering if this strange life they'd cobbled together was sustainable. Wondering what happened next. The answer came in early autumn, with the arrival of others. Eleanor was in the kitchen, boiling down fruit for preserves, when she heard voices from the courtyard. Multiple voices. Not Thomas. He'd gone to check the far fields. These were strangers. Her first instinct was fear. She grabbed the knife she'd been using to cut fruit, held it awkwardly in a hand more used to needles than weapons, and moved to the door. In the courtyard stood a group of 5 people, 3 adults and 2 children. They looked worn, tired, the kind of exhaustion that came from long travel and longer hardship. One of the men stepped forward when he saw her, his hands raised in a gesture of peace. "We mean no harm," he said quickly. "We saw smoke from the chimney. Thought there might be people here. We've been traveling for weeks, looking for ... He gestured vaguely, seemed unable to finish the sentence. "Looking for anywhere with people left alive," one of the women finished. She had a child on her hip, maybe 2 years old, watching Eleanor with large, solemn eyes. Eleanor lowered the knife, felt foolish for having drawn it. These weren't raiders or thieves. They were refugees. Survivors, like her and Thomas. Looking for the same thing everyone was looking for: community, safety, some semblance of the world that used to be. "There's not much here," she said carefully. "Just me and one other, but you're welcome to rest. To eat if you're hungry." The relief on their faces was palpable. The man who'd spoken first actually swayed on his feet, as if permission to stop had taken away the tension that had been keeping him upright. The woman with the child sat down right there in the courtyard, as if her legs simply wouldn't carry her anymore. Thomas returned an hour later to find the courtyard full of strangers, and Eleanor frantically trying to stretch their evening meal to feed 7 instead of 2. He took in the scene with wide eyes, and rolled up his sleeves and joined her in the kitchen without comment. Together, they produced something that resembled a proper meal bread: cheese, preserved meat from the cellar, vegetables from the garden, ale from the barrel in the storeroom that had somehow survived the winter. They ate in the kitchen, crowded around the table that hadn't seen this many people since before the plague. The newcomers ate with single-minded focus, too hungry for conversation. Eleanor and Thomas exchanged glances across the table, an entire conversation happening in silence. What do we do? Can we feed this many? Should we let them stay? But watching the children eat, they'd been hungry, really hungry, in a way that made Eleanor's occasional missed meals seem trivial. She knew the answer. They couldn't turn them away. Couldn't send them back out onto the empty roads. There was room here. Food enough, if they were careful. And more than that, there was the simple human need for community, for connection, for more than just 2 people clinging to survival in an empty manor. After the meal, after the newcomers had been shown to rooms and given blankets and told they could stay at least for the night, Eleanor and Thomas stood in the courtyard under the stars. "This changes things," Thomas said quietly. "I know. We can't support 7 people on what we're producing now. We'd need to clear more land, plant more next spring, hunt more, preserve more, plan more. I know. It would be work, constant work. And we'd need to figure out ... organization. Who does what? How decisions get made. All of that. I know." He looked at her. Do you want them to stay? She thought about it. About the quiet life she and Thomas had built over the summer. The simple rhythms that had become comfortable. About how adding 5 people would complicate everything, would require negotiation and compromise, and all the messy difficulty of community. About how much easier it would be to send them on their way with some supplies and good wishes. And then she thought about the child's eyes at the table, about the relief on their faces when she'd said they could rest, about Thomas's arrival months ago and how much difference one other person had made, about the fact that humans weren't meant to live in isolation, that survival without community wasn't really survival at all. Yes, she said, I want them to stay. If they want to, we'll figure out the rest. Thomas nodded slowly. Then we'll figure it out. And in the months that followed, they did. The 5 became 7, became 12, as others found their way to the manor. Word spread somehow, through whatever mysterious channels news traveled when the normal routes of communication had collapsed. There's a place, people said. A manor west of the old village. People there, survivors, making it work. They'll take you in if you're willing to work. Not everyone who came stayed. Some were passing through, needed only a meal and a night's sea rest before moving on to wherever they imagined safety might be found. Others stayed a few days or weeks, and decided the life here wasn't for them. Too much work, too isolated, too far from whatever they were looking for. But enough stayed that, by the time winter arrived, the manor household had swelled to 15 people. It was chaos at first. They had to figure out everything from scratch, how to organize the work, how to distribute resources fairly, how to make decisions that affected everyone. They had arguments, disagreements over who should do what, how supplies should be allocated, what their priorities should be. Eleanor, who had never expected to be in charge of anything more complicated than her own needlework, found herself mediating disputes and making judgments she had no idea if she was qualified to make. But Thomas helped. So did others. Robert, who'd been a carpenter and took charge of building and repair. Sarah, who'd been a brewer's wife and knew how to manage stores and supplies. Old Peter, who survived by sheer stubbornness and had a way of settling arguments with gruff common sense that somehow everyone accepted. Slowly, painfully, they built something that resembled a functional community. Not the hierarchical household the manor had once been. That model belonged to a world that was gone. Instead, they created something new, something more equal, where people contributed what they could and received what they needed, and decisions were made collectively, if not always smoothly. The fields that Thomas had said they'd need to clear got cleared, the work shared among many hands. The stores that Eleanor had worried couldn't support more people got supplemented by hunting, foraging, trading with the handful of other survivor communities they discovered within traveling distance. The manor that had felt so empty filled with voices, with life, with the complicated, messy business of people trying to live together. There were births that wintered, 2 babies born to couples who'd found each other in the aftermath. There were deaths 2 old Peter passed peacefully in his sleep, and a young man died from a fall while repairing the roof. They buried them in the old kitchen garden that had become their graveyard, said the prayers they could remember, and moved on, because moving on was what you did. And through it all, the manor itself seemed to wake up. The courtyard rang with children's voices. The kitchen was always busy, always warm, always full of people. The rooms that had stood empty were occupied again. The fields were worked. The animals tended. The manor functioned, not as it had before, but as something new. Something that belonged to all of them now, not just Eleanor, not just the memory of her family's name. Eleanor herself changed with it. The girl who'd stood alone in the courtyard watching apple blossoms fall was gone, had been replaced by someone harder, more capable, more certain. She was one leader among several now, her voice carrying weight, not because of her family name, but because she'd survived and worked and proven herself worthy of trust. The class distinctions that had defined her old life blurred and eventually faded. She worked alongside the others, ate with them, shared in the decisions and the consequences. She was simply Eleanor now. Not Lady Eleanor, not the Lord's daughter. Just Eleanor, one person among many, all of them trying to build something worth keeping. Thomas remained her closest companion through all of it, her partner in the strange work of creating community from catastrophe. Their relationship had shifted over the months, becoming something neither could easily name, but both relied on. Not quite friends, though they were friendly. Not master and servant, though she still technically owned the land they worked. Something more complicated, more equal, more essential. They worked together, planned together, argued occasionally, and made up without drama. When decisions needed making, she looked to him first. When trouble arose, he looked to her. People in the household joked sometimes about when they would marry. It seemed inevitable to the others. Two people who worked so closely, who clearly cared for each other, who made such a natural partnership. But neither Eleanor nor Thomas spoke of it. Perhaps they were both too aware of how fragile everything was, how quickly the world could shift. Perhaps they needed the relationship to remain undefined, flexible, capable of adapting to whatever came next. Or perhaps they simply didn't have the energy for romance when survival took all they had. Spring came again, the second spring after the plague, though they'd stopped counting time that way. It was just spring now, marked by returning warmth in longer days, and the endless work of planting that would feed them through the next winter. The apple tree in the courtyard bloomed, as it had the year before, but this time the blossoms fell on grass, worn thin by many feet, and children played beneath its branches, and the sight of it made Eleanor smile instead of despair. She stood at the gate one morning, looking out at the road that had brought Thomas, that had brought all the others, that connected them to whatever remained of the wider world. The road was less empty now. People traveled it, occasionally messengers from other survivor communities, traders with goods to barter, refugees still looking for safety. The world hadn't ended after all. It had just changed, brutally and completely, and was now slowly knitting itself back together in new patterns. Thomas joined her at the gate, stood beside her looking at the same road. Thinking about leaving? He asked. No, she said, surprised by how certain she felt. Thinking about staying. About how strange that is. How much everything's changed. Strange good or strange bad, she considered. Just strange. Different. Not what I would have chosen if I'd had a choice. But not bad. Not anymore. We did well, Thomas said. All of us. Built something that works. We did. They stood in comfortable silence, watching the road, watching the world that continued to exist and change and surprise them. Behind them, the manor hummed with life voices from the kitchen, someone singing while they worked, the sound of children arguing over some game. It wasn't the world they'd known. Wasn't the life either of them had expected. But it was theirs now, built from ruins and stubbornness, and the simple human refusal to give in to despair. The apple blossoms drifted on the morning breeze. The sun climbed higher in the sky, and Eleanor Ashford, who had once been a lord's daughter and was now simply Eleanor, one person among many in a community of survivors, turned away from the gate and walked back toward the life they'd made. The life they were still making, the life that continued despite everything and because of everything. The future was uncertain. It always had been, really, even in the old world that had seemed so stable and fixed. But uncertainty wasn't the same as hopelessness. They had hands to work with, land to work, people to work alongside. They had skills they'd learned and skills they'd yet to learn. They had each other in all the complicated ways that phrase meant. And they had time. Time to grow, to change, to build. Time to make mistakes and learn from them. Time to create something new from the ashes of what had been lost. It wasn't the life anyone would have chosen, but it was life nonetheless. And that, Eleanor thought, as she crossed the courtyard toward the sound of voices calling her name, was more than enough. The days lengthen and shorten in their endless cycle. Seasons turn, years pass. The manor stands, weathered but sound, home to people who've learned to make a life from what remains. The dead are remembered, but not dwelled upon. The past is acknowledged, but not worshipped. And the future stretches ahead, unknown and unknowable, carrying whatever it will carry. In the courtyard, the apple tree continues its blooming and fruiting, marking time in the way trees do steadily, patiently, year after year. Children grow up knowing no other world than this one, these fields, these people. Stories are told on winter nights of the time before, but they're growing dimmer, more mythical, less real. Life goes on. It always does. Even after catastrophe, even after everything ends, even when it seems impossible that anything could continue, life finds a way to persist, to adapt, to begin again. And on a spring morning years after that first terrible spring, Eleanor stands in the same courtyard, older now, her hair showing threads of gray, her hands permanently marked by labor. She watches a young couple, neither of them born, before the plague argue good-naturedly about how to repair a fence, and she remembers standing here alone, believing she was the last person in a dead world. She was wrong, thankfully, wonderfully wrong. The world wasn't dead, just changed, just waiting for people stubborn enough and hopeful enough to begin again. She smiles, turns, and walks toward the kitchen where bread is baking and people are gathering for the morning meal. There's work to do today, as there's always work to do. Fields to tend, animals to care for, a community to maintain. It's a good life, she thinks, different from the one she was born to expect, but good nonetheless. Perhaps better in its way, more real, more earned. The sun rises higher, the day unfolds, and Eleanor Ashford, survivor and builder of new worlds, goes to meet it with capable hands and a grateful heart. The apple blossoms fall like snow in the spring breeze, covering the courtyard stones in white petals. In the kitchen, someone laughs. In the fields, work begins. In the manor house that has become a home for so many, life continues its patient, persistent, miraculous unfolding. And the world, broken and broken and mended again, spins on into whatever comes next, carrying all of them with it into the unknowable future.